Grand Archive just did something crazy with their Proxia's Vault system. They have added a free print and play card for the rest of the season for the Assorted Reflections metagame that is brought forward from the next set. But right now you can print and play it without owning the actual card in competitive events. And I think this is going to totally change the metagame. So in this video, let's talk about why that is. What's up, everyone? It's Dan with Main Deck, and welcome back to another short and sweet Grand Archive video. We're going to be talking about Purifying Thurible today. Purifying Thurible is the new Proxia's Vault card, and it's one that you have to know about. This is a 0 memory cost Wind Regalia, and this Wind Regalia has the ability to pay X and banish it to make target opponent banish X cards from their graveyard they choose. If X is 3 or greater, you get to draw a card into your memory. And now, this card was brought out specifically as a way to combat Rile the Abyss. If you have missed our metagame update, you may have missed, but probably not, the impact of Rile the Abyss, this crazy card that has allowed fire decks to really efficiently gather cards and especially get to level 3 and execute really powerful level 3 strategies. And while that's really fun and really good, and we all love when level 3 strategies are a part of the metagame, we don't exactly want them to be every single deck that you see. Every single deck in the top 8 of Ascent Boston was playing Rile the Abyss, which, you know, maybe that's like a little bit too much. So enter Purifying Thurible. This card is going to make, I think, a big impact on the metagame, bringing win decks back in to compete with Rile the Abyss. And why is that? Purifying Thurible has this ability to banish X cards from your opponent's graveyard, so you do need to hold up some amount of cards in hand, some amount of reserve to be able to activate this cost for a reasonable amount. If you only have one card to pay for it, if you put one into X and make them banish one card from their graveyard, remember they can always just banish the Rile the Abyss. They don't have to banish anything else. So you do need to hold enough cards up to activate this, but you really want to, because if X is 3 or greater, you get to draw a card into your memory. And that's crazy. This is like Backup Charger. You guys remember this card? Backup Charger would just allow players would play this even if they didn't use the power cell for anything, just to be able to simply draw a card when they need to in the recollection phase to get that free extra card advantage. Now, Purifying Thurible is not a card you're probably just going to slam out there in your recollection phase most of the time to draw a card, because instead you're going to want to put this out to really stymie these graveyard-based strategies. You can materialize this card, and now whenever the opponent activates Rile the Abyss, as long as you're holding up at least 3 cards, you can make sure you can banish a lot of what they play. Now, later on in the game, Rile the Abyss will have the ability to pop out there and have some buffer in the graveyard, right? It means that if your opponent already has 2 cards that they don't care about in their graveyard, and then they play Rile the Abyss, now you have to hold more than 3 cards up to be able to hit the floating memory or the liminal guide that they go ahead and discard to the Rile. I think that's a really fair part of this card, right? This isn't going to totally shut down Rile the Abyss decks. It's not going to say Rile the Abyss is an unplayable card now. It's an unplayable deck. Any deck playing Rile the Abyss is absolutely dead. I think that this is going to make Rile the Abyss slow down the amount it needs to for other decks to start to compete with it a little bit. But some Rile the Abyss decks will still be just fine, as they'll just say, that's fine, I'm just going to level, I'll get my Rile advantage later on, play that a little later in the game. It's not going to be quite as powerful, but it'll be pretty good. However, there's one thing we have to talk about with Thurible, which is the fact that you do have to materialize it before the opponent gets their Rile advantage in order for it to be effective. And one of the things we've seen with cards like Cleansing Reunion is that when you didn't have them in your opening hand, it just wasn't effective enough to draw this later on against Rile, because so much of Rile's advantage comes from this first turn of discarding a floating memory and a liminal guide, and then using the float to level and drawing the card off the liminal guide when you go to level 1. And if Rile goes later in the game, they don't usually care that much about discarding floating memory or discarding cards to be able to get that advantage, because they already got it. They're good. They're happy. And so when you have a card that's a material deck card that needs to come out against the opponent, a lot like Censor of Restful Pieces currently, if the opponent already riles when then you go ahead and put your Censor out, it's just not doing enough. Now, Censor of Restful Peace had one other Achilles heel, which is that your opponent could play Reduce to Ash or Verucan Acolyte or something to deal with the Censor. that is something that a lot of Ryle decks were running. They all were running 3-4 copies of Reduced to Ash in the main so they could deal with it. And then some were also running things like Rook and Acolyte to deal with those sensors as well. So they had plenty of ways to just kind of, you would censor, they would answer the censor. You got a little bit of tempo out of the deal, but you lost a materialized phase. But they ultimately get their floating memory back, and they're usually pretty okay with that exchange. Thurible is a pretty obnoxious card to try and reduce. You can reduce it before you play the Ryle, but then you're stuck with not really getting advantage from your Ryle when you wanted it. And still, your opponent can activate for X, even if there's not X cards to banish, and draw a card into memory. So I think that's not going to be as big of an Achilles heel, but the big Achilles heel is who's going first or second in a match. Because if the Ryle deck is taking the first turn, and then the Windex takes the second turn, on their first turn, they still have to materialize a Spirit. So you can't put the Thurible out until your second turn, at which point the Ryle deck has already had a chance to play Ryle, banish float, get advantage. Unless I think you're going to see a lot of players play Beseech the Winds in their Windex going into this new metagame. I think this card is going to be a huge player for allowing these Windex to get this Purifying Thurible out on turn 1. Now, if you really want to hate on Ryle decks, you can run 4 copies of Beseech the Winds and still run your cards like Cleansing Ritual, or Cleansing Reunion. Excuse me, did I say Ritual earlier? Cleansing Reunion, in order to have lots of ways of dealing with your opponent's graveyard, including just going, my turn, Beseech Thurible, go ahead and Ryle as much as you want. Because beautifully, when you're taking the second turn of the game and you Beseech Thurible, you're left with 4 cards in hand, and that allows you to banish more than enough to take the opponent's, most of the opponent's cards in the graveyard out, unless they had some kind of exactly perfect start. And it's going to be really, really tough, I think, for the opponent to play around that right away. You're definitely going to buy yourself that bit of extra time, and then when you do activate it, you get to draw that card, so you didn't lose that card. So it ended up being like taking a backup charger turn early on for you, and it hurt the opponent's advantage for them. So I think it's going to be a huge play. I think people are really, really, really going to want to do things like Beseech the Thurible, and it's something that I expect players to explore a lot going into Ascent Taipei. Thurible is a really cool card, and I think especially for some decks like Shadow Strike Tristan, like Wind Luxem, these are decks that love holding up action to play instead, because you could imagine the response opponents might have is, okay, a Thurible's in play, I'm just not going to play Ryle. I'm just going to go ahead and do other things. And that's where these decks that play really strong fast activation cards like Surveil the Winds can just go, great, my turn, level up, Surveil the Winds, Recollect, and continue. And now they get to continue. They get to keep that Thurible in place, still activate it whenever they want to, but they can just start playing their actual game with this fact activation stuff to back it up when they don't need to spend the X resources on Thurible. So I think that's the kind of stuff you're going to see going forward. Now, the question will be, if this is true, what happens to the metagame after the Wind decks become popular? And that's where I think you may start to see Water decks creeping back into the metagame as an answer to these slower Wind decks that are starting to take the Ryle decks out. And if Water decks become popular, well, then our Fire aggro decks get to come back, or our Fire mid-range decks, our Fire Ryle decks maybe have more of a field day again, going back into them, able to take a lot of those ones out. So I really think Thurible is a very, very important part of rebuilding our rock, paper, scissors metagame, which, while we had a diverse metagame with Ryle the Abyss, might have been just a little bit too fire focused. So it's going to be nice to see. But I definitely want to know what you all think the impact of Thurible is going to be. Do you think Beseech the Winds is going to be what's needed to get it out at the speed required? Or is it still going to be a little awkward and Ryle decks will find a way to adapt around it and still be dominant? And that's the important part, because I think they're going to be playable still. I'm definitely not saying Thurible kills Ryle. I am saying it allows a lot of other decks a chance to play the game a little bit more now. And I think we're going to see a lot more of a diverse metagame. But maybe you disagree. Let me know in the comments down below what you think, and what you think about Weeb's and Proxia's Vault, their ability to bring this out so you can just print and play this now. Even though this is coming in Phantom Monarchs, is coming in the next set. It's so cool that they can just shift the metagame a little bit. That's what I think, at least. But let me know in the comments down below. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. Hope you're looking forward to our Wind Overlords coming over, or our Ryle Overlords continuing to dominate. Either way, it's going to be great to see, just like it's going to be great to see you all in the next one.